So this morning I want to pick up the story of Abraham. And I want to make a claim here on this, that it's through Abraham and through this story that the rest of the Bible hangs on this particular passage. I know you're thinking, that's a pretty big claim there. Well, it is, but there's a lot to that. You see, what we were talking about last week is in the first 11 or so chapters of Genesis, you get all the big stuff. You get the fall, Adam and Eve, Eden, Noah's Ark, Tower of Babel, all this stuff. And then in chapter 11 and 12, it narrows down to one family. And we get the story of Abraham and his descendants. And you see, that's where all this comes from. You see, what happens is in the very beginning, there's Eden. And humanity and everything is all good. And there's no sin, and there's no sorrow, and there's no death, and there's no pain. And of course, we can't have nice things, so we mess it up. And then what happens in chapter 12 is God is saying, okay, we're going to build this pathway to restore this place where there's no sin and no sorrow and no death and no pain. And it starts here. And it starts with God saying to this guy, Abraham, I want you to leave home and go to this other place. Because what happens is God builds this line of people from Abraham through people like David and Solomon all the way to Jesus. And it's in Jesus that everything gets restored. Now, what do we learn from the story of Abraham itself? See, Abraham is living in this place called Ur, or around this place called Ur. And it's this city in what today is Iraq, back then was Babylon. And God says, I want you to leave there and go to this land I'm going to show you. He says, I want you to go. And people who bless you, I'll bless. And people who curse you, I'll curse. And you will be a blessing for all families in all the world. What do we have to learn from this? How does this mean for us personally? Well, the first thing is God is always calling you to a new place. And I know some of you are thinking, you're thinking, I have lived here all my life, and I'm not going anywhere. And my parents and my grandparents all lived here, and they didn't go anywhere either. We're here. Now, that might be true, but sometimes you're called to a new place, and you don't move geographically. There's always a new point in life. I was talking to a friend of mine a couple of weeks ago. He just retired recently. And I was having a good conversation. I asked him what he didn't miss from ministry. And we were talking about this, that, and the other thing. And he says, it's kind of weird. He says, you start out and you're the young guy and you want to tear everything down and build up new stuff. And you want to do all these great things. And then you blink. And you're the middle-aged guy in charge. And then you blink again, and you're the retired guy, and people just come to you occasionally and ask you for advice. And he said, every one of those stages is fine, and there's wonderful things about them. But if you get confused as to where you're at, you get in real trouble. See, it's like God calls you to that next stage. God calls you to that next layer. And if you're not mentally moving, your reflexes and your answers go the wrong way. So that's part of it. We're called to always be aware of our surroundings and be ready to move to the next thing, even though sometimes it's hard. Let me tell you this story. You guys, a lot of you have heard my stories about doing ministry in different places. And there's one congregation I never really talk about. And I know everybody's immediate reaction is, ooh, how bad was it? But it's actually kind of the opposite of that. I was there for 5 months doing some interim stuff, and they were a healthy congregation, and so nothing interesting was happening. So I was just there, and it was fine. It was a good place. But what I want to share is the name of that congregation was Zion's English Lutheran Church. And the interesting word in that is English. And if you've ever been a part of a congregation with the name English in the name, what it means is they were the first one in that town or that community to do worship in English. And so, I don't know, sometime at the end of the 1800s, this congregation said, we love German, we all speak German, but the kids and the grandkids don't speak German anymore. And it's that story all across Ohio, Wisconsin, North Dakota, Minnesota. I mean, I live right across the street from the cemetery. They're my quiet neighbors. And I also live half a mile from the Speedway. They're my noisy neighbors, okay? But you walk through that cemetery, and sometime about 1910, the gravestone switched from German to English. And I mean, I think it was a great thing they switched from German to English. But do you think it was easy? Do you think it was easy to give up those songs that they heard their parents and their grandparents and their great-grandparents singing back in the old country, to switch for a new generation? I had a friend of mine. He's one of those annoying people that just picks up all sorts of different languages and it looks easy for them. He spoke like 5 different languages, spoke German fluently, got his master's studying theology over in Germany somewhere. And he made this interesting observation, that even though he could dream in German, he could speak in German, he could think in German, he still prayed in English. And what the reason for that was, he said, that was his mother tongue, the language of his heart. And so as much as he might try, he'd always revert to English when he prayed. And I tell you that to point out the sacrifice that those people, that congregation made 140 years ago or so. Because they understood God was calling them to that new place. God was calling them to that new thing. And it's always a question for us, what is God calling us to? And I'm going to tell you that it's not without anxiety. It's not without that fear of, okay, here's this new thing, and I know I'm supposed to go here, and I might even be excited to go there, but it's scary. It's always scary. And one of the things I just want to share with you, just because it makes your life easier, and you probably know this, but it's good to be reminded. A lot of times when we have anxiety in our lives, we take it out on the person who's close at hand and not the person who is causing the anxiety. Let me tell you a story. A number of years ago, I was at this congregation, and somebody who was important to the congregation, who everybody loved, was having major surgery. And so I talked to the family ahead of time and said, okay, how do you want to let people know after surgery is over? What do we want to tell people? How do you want to do that? And we talked about it. And he said, do you want to do Caring Bridge? And they're like, no, for these reasons we don't want to do that. Why don't we just send out this email to this list? I'm like, okay, that's fine. So this guy has surgery, comes through just fine. We do the communication plan that we had talked about. And like 2 days later, I'm getting absolutely chewed out by this staff member because of this communication plan. And she's like, well, what if you weren't on that email list? What would you have done? How would you? And I'm sitting there like, okay, this is what I talked to with the family. Why is she so upset with me? And like 24 or 48 hours, it finally clicked at me, oh, this is somebody she cares deeply about, and she's worried about them. And she's taking the anxiety out on me. I'm slow, but I get there in the end. Okay? I tell you that because I want you to be aware when you're in those situations, when you're anxious about stuff, when you're terrified about stuff, sometimes you take it out on the people that don't deserve it. How many times have you been angry in traffic when it's not about traffic, it's about something that happened at work? Okay? And I tell you about that because also sometimes you're on the receiving end of that from your spouse, your kids, your siblings, your parents. And it's just easier to understand and take when it's not about you. Now, there's one other interesting little piece of this that I want to examine. I want to examine this question of what do we do with the people who are stuck in their journey? There is this fascinating little loose end in this narrative. Remember, I always say, yes, you read the Bible as history, as in these events happened, but it's also literature. It's also a story being told. And there's this little loose end at the end of the part just before what Pam read. The end of chapter 11. It deals with Abraham's father, a guy by the name of Terah. And what happens is Terah leaves Ur, the same city we're talking about, gets as far as Haran. His son dies, and he doesn't go any farther. And biblical scholars have batted this around endlessly, and the answer is nobody knows. But you have to wonder, did God call Abraham's father to this promised land? And was he going to make that same offer to Abraham's father? And Abraham's father got stuck in grief and stopped there in this town where his son died. And he was never able to move on. The answer is we don't know. We'll never know. But it's a question. And it's this human drama. And we all know people who get stuck. And the funny thing is you look at the life of Abraham, and Abraham is this 2 steps forward, 1 step back kind of guy. He's always doing that, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. God tells him, okay, leave Ur, go to this land I'm going to show you. And so Abraham does. And then he keeps going down through Egypt. And then he meets Pharaoh and says, oh yeah, this pretty woman I'm with, it's not my wife, that's my sister. He constantly is doing these things. And yet, when you look at the book of Hebrews talks about Abraham as this giant of faith. And it's not that the author of Hebrews doesn't know any of this. It's that the author of Hebrews is saying, yeah, the big picture, the important stuff, is he kept moving. And so the way we respond to people who are stuck, or ourselves when we're stuck, is to remember that God never lets us go. Even when Abraham takes these detours, even when Abraham takes these missteps or settles in the wrong place or does these things where he's not listening to God, God still calls him. God still reaches him. And the thing is that what this first message from God to Abram is I'll bless those who bless you. And so we're called to bless the people who are like Abraham, who are on their journey, but get stuck. We're called to say, you know what? You're called to something more. You're called to something new. And for us to be reminded that when it seems like we can't get anywhere, that it's insurmountable, that God doesn't give up on us, that God doesn't let go of us. And it's this chance to move forward in him and know that our journey does not end. So as you go through this week, meditate on those questions. What is God calling me to? And who do I bless? Amen.